Irresponsible. In Sensibly Speaking number 85, you discuss the Scientology definition of responsibility and then also relate it to security checking. I'd like to ask something in that context. Say some transgression is uncovered in a sec check, cheating, stealing, sex with a member of another species, etc. Then this transgression is dealt with, if I understood it correctly, by telling every little detail about it and eventually accepting responsibility for it, correct? Is it now forgiven? After all, the person is now cool with it, so the next time around, the answer to the interspecies question will be a cold-blooded yes. Do they then just move on, or are the same transgressions discussed again with every new sec check? Security checking is a really big subject in Scientology, so I can't explain the whole thing in just a few minutes, but basically the procedure runs of asking a person a question with the meter, like, looking for responses on the meter, and if the meter does respond to a question, then taking it up with the person and saying, okay, what's your answer to this question of have you ever, stolen an apple, let's say, right, or whatever the question is. That's a dummy question. They don't ask, have you ever stolen an apple, but it's just used as an example. So if you're asked this question, then you're going to answer it, yeah, sure, I stole an apple, a week ago. Okay, great. What did you do? When was that? Is that all of that? How did you justify it? Right? In other words, how did you make it okay with yourself and your mind that you do this thing? And who missed it? In other words, who almost found out about it? Who should have known about it that didn't find out about it? Right? Oh, well, the guy who sells apples should have known about it, and he looked at me funny when I was walking out of the store, and so that made me wonder whether or not he knew, right? This whole who missed it, is another Scientology specific piece of security checking. And you get all the people who nearly found out about it or should have known about it or did something to make the person wonder whether or not, they knew what you had done, right? That's what's called missing the withhold. And once you get all that, then the needle is supposed to do this kind of thing. It's supposed to float, right? Very idly, gradually, back and forth. And if it's not doing that, then the the sec checker is going to ask the person, is there an earlier similar overt? Or is there an earlier similar time you stole an apple? And the person will then go, oh, well, let me look and see, right? And if they can't find anything, then the sec checker will say, well, is there any more to this last overt, right? And the person might look and go, oh, well, yeah, also, it wasn't just one apple, it was two, right? Oh, okay, good. And they'll run through the whole procedure again. And if the needle's not floating on the meter, then the earlier similar question comes up again, right? Is there an earlier similar time you stole an apple? Oh, yeah, well, there was a time I stole an apple, 10 years ago. Okay, great. What happened? Good. When was that? What did is that all of that? Same procedure, right? And they run through the whole thing with that incident 10 years ago. And if the needle is still not floating, they'll go earlier, similar. And they will take this chain down, and there could be 10, 20 incidents of having stolen apples going all the way back 3,000 years ago, right, to earlier lifetimes when a person stole an apple. And this is how Scientology auditing works, and sec checking specifically, to get to earlier lifetimes, right, and recall things from earlier lifetimes, which I now consider to be mostly just imagination. People are just making the shit up, but at the time, in Scientology, they believe these things, right, and so. So that's more technically how the procedure works. But once you've gotten the whole thing off, you've answered the question all the way down to the needle floating, the sec checker will say, okay, your needle's floating now. And then they will recheck the question. Have you ever stolen an apple? And the needle is expected to continue to float when asking that question. And if it's not floating, there's a whole series of questions that can be asked to try to see to try to get the meter to respond and find out what else is going on here, that maybe there's something else about having stolen apples that the person isn't confessing, and getting that off from the person, right? And again, going through that whole gamut of that whole procedure, earlier similar to FN, to a floating needle, which is called an FN. And then rechecking the question until the needle is floating when the question is asked, Then they go on to the next question on the form of security check questions or sec check questions that are being asked of the person. And that's basically how a sec check is done. So you can end up answering the same question multiple times in the same sec check, but once the needle floats on that question, you're done with it. You probably won't be asked about that again because you took it to an FN, and in Scientology they think that's very, very important. And now, if in a later session you're being asked a similar question, but not the same question, let's say, have you ever stolen a fruit, a piece of fruit, or have you ever stolen food, or something like that, where, maybe this is going to come up again. If the needle were to read, if the meter were to respond to that, then you might go back to, well, I stole, an apple a year ago. And if it's the same sec checker, if the sec checker is familiar with what you've already confessed, they might say, well, yeah, we've already talked about that. Is there something more to it we don't know? Because you're not expected to have to say the same overts, the same transgressions over and over and over again. It happens sometimes, but it's not supposed to happen. And if it does come up again and the meter is responding to it, in other words, you're saying, yeah, I stole an apple, a year ago, and the meter's going ding, 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 then the auditor will take your answer and they will go through that whole procedure with you. But they're not supposed to be, constantly redoing the same, transgressions. So that's basically how that's supposed to work. And once you have sort of coughed up all the goods, you're supposed to feel better about it. That's what causes the needle to float in the first place, is the person has experienced some relief and some de-stressing, and they're actually happy about the whole thing now. And once that's happened, you don't really have a whole lot of attention on it anymore, and yeah, you are forgiven. In fact, in Scientology, there are two ways that you can be security checked. One of them involves a forgiveness step. And this is when you're being audited, like you're a public person or a staff member, and you're just doing your bridge to total freedom, all those steps. Well, one of those steps on that bridge to total freedom, on that grade chart, is grade 2, which involves it has to do with overts and withholds, or moral transgressions. And you will be security checked, right? They will be asking you questions and expecting answers on your moral transgressions, and they'll run through that whole procedure. When that's done as a part of routine, regular auditing in Scientology, that's confidential, right? It's supposed to just stay in your folder. You don't then go to the ethics officer after your security check is done and have to answer up and make amends for what you confessed in your sec checking. And when the sec check is completed, every question has, reached a floating needle, then there is a step where the auditor says to you, you are now forgiven by Scientology and Scientologists for, your transgressions. And the person goes, God, I feel so much better now. Thank you. Because it's a big, it's like the, Spiritus, Spuminus, Spaminus, 20 Hail Marys, and we won't talk about this anymore. Now, the other kind of sec checking, and the one that you hear about a lot more often from people like me and other ex-Scientologists, is when sec checking is being done for investigatory reasons. And in those cases, you're being told at the beginning of the procedure is exactly the same, but you're told at the beginning, I am not auditing you. That's what the sec checker says. And so they follow the same auditing procedure, but it's not confidential. Reports are written based on what you've confessed, and you then have to see an ethics officer afterwards in order to make up the damage and make amends for what you did. And after that's all done, again, you're kind of, forgiven. There's no official forgiveness step, but once you've done your ethics thing with the ethics officer and you're done your amends for whatever you did, like if you say, yeah, I stole 10 apples from the grocer, maybe your amends is you go replace those apples and you confess to the grocer, hey, I stole 10 apples a year ago, and here's 10 apples back to you, right, or 20 or whatever. And that would be the investigatory type of sec checking, and that gets done when you're in trouble within Scientology, and it happens all the time. The entire RPF program that I've talked about is done that way. It's all not auditing you style sec checking, where everything you say in the session is actionable, back to you, and you're going to be doing amends for all the things that you cough up to. So that's basically, that's a whole lot of data, but that's kind of sec checking in a nutshell, and I hope that answers your question.